The day my son told me I was too old to live alone, I was standing in my kitchen making his favorite lemon pound cake from scratch. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, a 72-year-old woman who had just finished renovating her entire garden, preparing a dessert that required precise timing and technique, while being lectured about my supposed incompetence. "Mom, you're not getting any younger," Daniel said, not even looking up from his phone as he scrolled through what I could only assume were real estate listings. "This house is too big for you. Too many stairs. What if you fall? What if something happens and nobody's around to help?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I continued folding the batter, watching the golden mixture cascade from my wooden spoon. 60 years of marriage to his father had taught me when to speak and when to let silence do the talking. Daniel had inherited his father's tendency to fill quiet spaces with increasingly ridiculous justifications for decisions he'd already made. "I've been looking at some really nice assisted living communities," he continued, finally glancing up. "They have activities, medical staff on site, people your own age. You'd love it, Mom. No more worrying about maintenance or cooking or any of that stuff." That conversation happened on a Tuesday in March. By Thursday, I knew exactly what Daniel was really after, and it had nothing to do with my well-being. My name is Margaret Holloway, though most people call me Maggie. I've lived in the same house for 47 years, raised 3 children within its walls, and buried a husband from its front porch. The house sits on 12 acres in what used to be the outskirts of town, but is now considered prime real estate. Daniel had been circling it like a vulture ever since his father passed 2 years ago. The revelation came through my neighbor, Eleanor Prescott, who stopped by Friday morning with fresh coffee and gossip that would change everything. Eleanor had worked as a secretary at the county assessor's office for 30 years before retiring, and she still had friends who kept her informed about property transactions and development plans. "Maggie, honey," she said, settling into the chair across from my kitchen table, "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I think you need to know. There's been talk at the office about your property." I poured her coffee, noting how her usually cheerful demeanor had shifted to something more serious. Eleanor wasn't one for drama, which made her next words all the more striking. "A development company called Summit Ridge Holdings has been making inquiries about purchasing land in this area. Big inquiries. They're talking about a luxury resort and golf course complex." She paused, stirring her coffee slowly. "The thing is, they specifically mentioned your property as a key piece they'd need to make the project viable." My hand stilled on my own coffee cup. "How specifically?" "They've apparently had preliminary discussions with someone claiming to represent your interests." Eleanor's eyes met mine across the table. "Someone who told them the property would likely be available within the next few months, due to the current owner needing to relocate to assisted care." The pieces clicked into place with an almost audible snap. Daniel's sudden concern about my living situation, his repeated mentions of assisted living communities, his insistence that I was becoming a burden to myself and others. It had never been about my safety or well-being. It had been about 12 acres of land worth millions to the right buyer. "Did they mention any names?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Eleanor nodded grimly. "Daniel Holloway, listed as your primary contact and future executor of your estate." I thanked Eleanor for the information and walked her to the door, maintaining the composed exterior I'd perfected over decades of raising children and managing household crises. But once she was gone, I allowed myself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of my son's betrayal. Then I got to work. The first call I made was to my attorney, Patricia Wells, a sharp woman in her 50s who had handled my family's legal affairs since my husband's death. Patricia had known Daniel since he was a teenager, which made her reaction to my news all the more telling. "I can't say I'm entirely surprised," she admitted when I finished explaining what Eleanor had told me. "Daniel contacted me last month asking about the process for obtaining power of attorney for elderly parents. He framed it as preventative planning, wanting to be prepared in case you ever became incapacitated." "And you told him?" "I told him that you were one of the most mentally sharp people I knew, and that any decisions about your legal affairs would remain yours to make until you decided otherwise." Patricia's voice carried a hint of steel. "I also told him that if he had concerns about your well-being, he should discuss them with you directly rather than going behind your back. Apparently, Daniel had taken that advice and decided that direct manipulation was his best course of action. The irony was almost amusing. He was so certain of his own cleverness, so convinced that a 72-year-old woman couldn't possibly see through his scheme, that he'd made a critical error. He'd underestimated his mother. The second call I made was to a private investigator Patricia recommended, a former police detective named Sarah Chen who specialized in financial investigations. If Daniel was working with Summit Ridge Holdings, there would be a paper trail. Emails, phone records, possibly even preliminary contracts or agreements. I wanted to know exactly how deep his betrayal ran and how long he'd been planning it. Sarah met me that afternoon at a small cafe downtown, a nondescript woman in her 40s, with intelligent eyes and the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of uncovering other people's secrets. She listened to my story without judgment, taking notes in a small leather notebook. "How much do you know about Summit Ridge Holdings?" she asked when I finished. "Nothing beyond what Eleanor told me. They're legitimate, but aggressive. They specialize in acquiring rural properties for luxury developments, often through intermediaries or family members who convince elderly property owners to sell." Sarah's pen tapped against her notebook. "The process usually involves gradually convincing the owner that they're no longer capable of maintaining their property, then positioning a sale as the responsible choice." The description fit Daniel's recent behavior perfectly. For the past 6 months, he'd been increasingly vocal about every minor maintenance issue at the house. A leaky faucet became evidence of plumbing problems I couldn't handle.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
A burned-out light bulb in a high fixture became proof that I was taking dangerous risks trying to change it myself. Each incident had been presented as further proof that I was in over my head. "What I don't understand," I told Sarah, "is why he's being so obvious about it. If he really wanted to manipulate me into selling, wouldn't he be more subtle?" Sarah smiled grimly. "In my experience, people who think they're the smartest person in the room often make the sloppiest mistakes. He's probably convinced that you'll never figure out what he's really doing." That evening, I called my other 2 children. Jennifer lived in Seattle with her family, working as a pediatric nurse and raising 2 teenagers. She'd always been the most emotionally intelligent of my children, the one who called regularly just to check in and actually listened to my answers. When I told her about Daniel's suggestions regarding assisted living, her response was immediate and predictable. "Are you kidding me? Mom, you're in better shape than most people half your age. You still maintain that enormous garden, you volunteer at the library twice a week, and you just finished redecorating the guest bathroom by yourself." Jennifer's voice carried the indignation I'd been suppressing. "Did Daniel hit his head? Why would he think you need assisted living?" I didn't tell her about the development company or my suspicions about Daniel's motives. I wanted to gather more information before involving my other children in what was likely to become a family crisis. My youngest son, Michael, was harder to reach. He was a traveling photographer, currently somewhere in South America documenting wildlife conservation efforts. When he finally called me back 3 days later, his reaction to Daniel's assisted living suggestions was more measured, but equally skeptical. "That doesn't sound like you, Mom," he said, his voice slightly distorted by the international connection. "Has something happened? Are you feeling less confident about living alone?" "Not at all," I assured him. "I was curious about your perspective on Daniel's concerns." Michael was quiet for a moment. "Daniel's always been protective, but this sounds excessive. Maybe he's projecting his own anxiety about Dad's death onto your situation?" It was a generous interpretation, more generous than Daniel deserved, but it reminded me why Michael had always been my most empathetic child. Unlike Daniel, who saw problems as things to be solved through control and manipulation, Michael looked for understanding and emotional truth. Over the next week, Sarah Chen worked her magic. The information she uncovered was even more damning than I'd expected. Daniel hadn't just been in preliminary discussions with Summit Ridge Holdings. He'd been actively negotiating on my behalf for over 3 months, presenting himself as my designated representative, and claiming that I was suffering from early-stage dementia that made me incapable of handling my own affairs. The email Sarah obtained through her contacts painted a clear picture of Daniel's strategy. He'd provided Summit Ridge with detailed information about my property, including recent appraisals, utility costs, and maintenance records he'd somehow accessed. He'd also shared what he claimed were medical concerns about my mental state, all fabricated, designed to support his narrative that I was no longer competent to make my own decisions. Most shocking of all was a preliminary purchase agreement he'd drafted, with my forged signature, selling the property to Summit Ridge for significantly below market value. The agreement included a clause stating that the sale was being facilitated by my son due to my diminished capacity, and that I would be relocating to an assisted living facility where I would be better cared for. Daniel stood to receive a substantial finder's fee from Summit Ridge, plus a percentage of the eventual development profits. The total amount would set him up financially for life, while leaving me with barely enough to cover a few years in even a modest assisted living facility. Reading through the documents Sarah had compiled, I felt a cold anger unlike anything I'd experienced since my husband's death. This wasn't just greed or opportunism. This was a calculated betrayal that attacked not just my financial security, but my independence, my dignity, and my fundamental right to control my own life. Daniel had been planning to have me declared incompetent. He'd researched the legal process for obtaining guardianship over elderly parents, consulted with doctors about the signs of dementia he could cite as evidence, and even toured assisted living facilities to find the most affordable option that would still allow him to claim he was acting in my best interests. But like many people who mistake cunning for intelligence, Daniel had made a crucial error. He'd based his entire plan on the assumption that I was exactly what he wanted me to be, a helpless elderly woman who could be easily manipulated and discarded. He'd forgotten that I was the same person who had managed a household budget through decades of economic ups and downs, navigated the complex bureaucracy of my husband's final illness, and successfully invested the proceeds from his life insurance policy to ensure my own financial security. More importantly, he'd forgotten that I was his mother, and I knew him better than he knew himself. That night, I sat in my husband's old study, surrounded by the documents Sarah had provided, and began planning my response. Daniel thought he was playing chess against someone who didn't even know the rules. He was about to discover that I'd been watching his moves from the beginning, and I was several steps ahead of him. The plan that began forming in my mind was inspired by Daniel's own strategy. He wanted to convince people that I was incompetent and needed to be managed by others. I was going to give him exactly what he thought he wanted, but with a twist he'd never see coming. If Daniel believed that elderly women were easy targets for manipulation, I was going to become the perfect mark. I would play the role of confused, vulnerable grandmother so convincingly that he'd walk directly into a trap of his own making. By the time he realized what was happening, it would be too late for him to escape the consequences of his own greed and cruelty. The irony was perfect. Daniel's plan depended on convincing others that I was losing my mental faculties. My plan would use his own assumptions against him, letting him believe he was succeeding right up until the moment his world collapsed around him. I spent the rest of that night making lists, researching options, and laying the groundwork for what would become the most satisfying project of my later years. Daniel had taught me something valuable about the kind of person he really was. Now I was going to teach him something about the kind of person he'd chosen to underestimate. By dawn, I had the outline of a strategy that would not only protect my property and independence, but would expose Daniel's betrayal in a way that ensured he could never attempt something like this again. It would require careful timing, strategic acting, and the kind of patient execution that came from decades of managing complex family dynamics. Daniel thought he was manipulating a helpless old woman. He was actually providing a masterclass in manipulation to someone who had been practicing the art since before he was born. The game was about to begin, and I had every intention of winning. The transformation began with a phone call to Daniel on a rainy Thursday morning. I made sure to sound slightly more confused than usual, letting my voice waver just enough to suggest uncertainty without being obvious about it. "Danny, sweetheart," I said, using the childhood nickname he'd outgrown decades ago. "I've been thinking about what you said. About the house being too much for me. The change in his tone was immediate. Where there had been impatience and barely concealed frustration during our previous conversations, now there was sudden attentiveness, almost predatory in its intensity. "Oh? What kinds of thoughts are you having, Mom?" "Well, I was trying to fix that loose banister yesterday, and I nearly took a tumble down the stairs. It got me thinking that maybe you're right. Maybe I am getting too old for all this." I paused, letting out a small, defeated sigh. The house feels so big and empty sometimes. "Mom, I'm so glad you're starting to see this clearly." His voice practically purred with satisfaction. "I hate the thought of you struggling alone when there are people who could help you. I suppose I should start looking into those places you mentioned, the assisted living communities." I made sure to sound reluctant, as if the words were being dragged out of me, though I have to admit, I'm not sure how to even begin that process. "Don't worry about any of that," Daniel said quickly. "I can handle all the research and arrangements. You don't need to stress yourself about the details." Of course he could handle it. He'd probably already made a list of the most affordable facilities, the ones that would leave him with the maximum profit from the property sale. But I played my part perfectly, expressing gratitude for his willingness to take charge and admitting that the whole situation felt overwhelming. "There is one thing, though," I added, as if the thought had just occurred to me. "I'd hate to burden you children with having to deal with selling the house and sorting through all your father's things. Maybe I should handle some of that myself before I move." "Absolutely not." Daniel's response was sharp, too sharp, before he caught himself and softened his tone. "I mean, that's exactly the kind of stress you shouldn't be putting on yourself right now. Why don't you let me take care of the house situation too? I can handle the sale, deal with any repairs or staging that needs to be done. You just focus on getting settled in your new place." It was almost too easy. Daniel was so eager to get his hands on the property that he was practically volunteering to incriminate himself. But I needed more than just his verbal agreements. I needed documentation, witnesses, and evidence that would hold up when the truth finally came to light. "That's so generous of you, Danny. But are you sure you have time for all that? I know how busy you are with your own life." "Mom, you raised me. Taking care of you is the least I can do." The false sincerity in his voice was nauseating, but I maintained my grateful, slightly confused elderly mother persona. Besides, I've already done some preliminary research into the real estate market. I know exactly what needs to be done to get you the best possible price. I bet he did. Sarah Chen's investigation had revealed that Daniel had been getting regular appraisals and market analyses for months, though not with my best interests in mind. The property was worth nearly $3 million at current market rates, but the preliminary agreement he'd drafted with Summit Ridge was for less than half that amount. "Well, if you're sure it's not too much trouble," I said, "I suppose I should give you power of attorney or something so you can handle the legal aspects." The silence on the other end of the line was telling. Daniel was probably grinning so hard his face hurt, thinking about how perfectly his plan was falling into place. When he spoke again, his voice was carefully controlled, trying not to sound too eager. "That would definitely make things easier, Mom. I could take care of everything much more efficiently if I had the proper legal authority." We arranged to meet the following Monday so he could help me, quote, "organize my affairs." I spent the weekend setting the stage for what would become the most elaborate performance of my life. The first step was recruiting allies, and I started with Eleanor Prescott. Over coffee and homemade scones, I explained my situation and outlined the role I needed her to play. Eleanor's eyes widened as I detailed Daniel's betrayal, but her expression quickly shifted to determined anger. "That little weasel," she said, using language I'd never heard from her before. "I watched that boy grow up, and to think he'd do this to his own mother." "I need you to be my witness," I told her. "Daniel is going to think he's manipulating a confused old woman, but I want everything documented. Can you be here Monday when he comes over?" Eleanor nodded firmly. "What do you need me to do?" "Just be yourself. Act concerned about my well-being, maybe mention that you've noticed me seeming forgetful lately. Nothing too dramatic. Just enough to support the narrative Daniel wants to believe." The second ally I recruited was my housekeeper, Rosa Martinez. who had been coming twice a week for the past 5 years. Rosa was in her 30s, sharp as a tack, and had developed a genuine affection for me over the years. More importantly, she had noticed Daniel's recent behavior and found it suspicious. "Mrs. Holloway," she said when I explained the situation, "I wondered why he was asking me so many questions about you. Last month, he wanted to know if you ever seemed confused, if you forgot things, if you had trouble taking care of yourself. What did you tell him?" Rosa's expression was indignant. "I told him you were sharper than most people half your age, and that he should be proud to have such a capable mother." He didn't seem happy with that answer. I asked Rosa to continue her normal cleaning schedule, but to pay attention to anything Daniel said or did during his visits. If he tried to coach her into saying I was declining mentally, I wanted her to play along while secretly documenting his attempts at manipulation. The third piece of my preparation involved setting up recording equipment. Sarah Chen had recommended a security consultant who specialized in domestic surveillance, a soft-spoken man named Tom Bradford, who installed hidden cameras and microphones throughout my house with the skill of someone who had done this many times before. "The beauty of these systems," Tom explained as he showed me how to operate the equipment, "is that everything is motion-activated and automatically uploaded to a secure cloud server. Even if someone finds and destroys the physical devices, the recordings will be preserved." By Sunday evening, my house was equipped with more surveillance technology than a government building, all completely invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look. Every conversation Daniel had in my home would be recorded in high-definition audio and video. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzly, perfect weather for the melancholy scene I was about to perform. I dressed carefully in an old cardigan and comfortable shoes, styling my hair in a slightly disheveled way that suggested I hadn't been taking as much care with my appearance as usual. The goal was to look like a woman who was beginning to struggle with the basic tasks of daily life. Daniel arrived promptly at 10 o'clock, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the kind of serious expression he probably thought made him look responsible and caring. He hugged me at the door, and I made sure to seem slightly unsteady on my feet, gripping his arm for support. "How are you feeling today, Mom?" "Oh, you know. Some days are better than others." I led him into the living room, moving slowly and pausing to rest my hand on furniture as if I needed the support. "I appreciate you coming over to help me figure all this out. It's gotten so complicated, and I just can't seem to keep track of everything anymore." Daniel's eyes lit up at this admission of confusion, though he tried to hide his satisfaction behind a mask of concern. "That's exactly why I'm here, Mom. You don't need to worry about keeping track of anything. I'll handle all the details." Eleanor arrived 15 minutes later, as we had planned. She knocked gently and let herself in through the front door, calling out a greeting as she had done hundreds of times over the years. "Maggie, dear, I brought you some of those ginger snap cookies you like." She paused in the doorway of the living room, taking in the scene of Daniel and me surrounded by papers and documents. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had company." "Eleanor, you remember my son Daniel," I said, my voice taking on the slightly formal tone elderly people sometimes used when they were trying to maintain social proprieties despite feeling overwhelmed. "Of course. Daniel, how nice to see you." Eleanor's performance was flawless, her concern appearing completely genuine. "Are you helping your mother with some paperwork? I know she's been feeling a bit overwhelmed lately with all the household management." Daniel practically vibrated with excitement at this opening. "Yes, we're working on getting some of Mom's affairs organized. She's been having some concerns about managing everything on her own." Eleanor nodded sympathetically, glancing at me with just the right amount of worried affection. "I have noticed you seeming a bit more tired lately, Maggie. And last week when we were talking about the garden club meeting, you seemed to have trouble remembering which day it was." I had, of course, coached Eleanor on this fictional incident, but she delivered it with such natural concern that even I almost believed it had happened. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention completely focused on Eleanor's words. "Has she seemed confused about other things?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral, but his body language screaming eagerness. "Well," Eleanor said hesitantly, as if she didn't want to betray a confidence, "there have been a few times when she's called me about things we'd already discussed." And I did notice that she left the stove on after making tea last week. Nothing dangerous, mind you, but not like her usual careful self. Another fabrication, but one that played perfectly into the narrative of a woman experiencing early cognitive decline. Daniel nodded gravely, filing away every detail for future use. "I'm so glad you're looking out for her," he said to Eleanor. "It makes me feel better knowing she has such caring neighbors." After Eleanor left, Daniel and I settled down to what he believed was the business of organizing my affairs, but was actually the process of documenting his fraud in excruciating detail. He had brought copies of power of attorney forms, already filled out with his name as my designated representative. Now, Mom, this might seem like a lot of legal language, but basically, this document just gives me the authority to help you with financial decisions and property management. He spoke slowly and clearly, as if explaining something complicated to a child. It's really just a formality that makes it easier for me to take care of things when you're not feeling up to dealing with them yourself. I studied the documents with a confused frown, pretending to struggle with the legal terminology. "I'm not sure I understand all of this, Danny. What exactly would you be able to do?" "Nothing you wouldn't want me to do," he assured me smoothly. "Just things like paying bills, managing investments, maybe handling the sale of the house when you're ready to move to assisted living. It would all be done with your best interests in mind, of course." Of course. I asked him to explain several sections of the power of attorney multiple times, playing the part of an elderly woman who wanted to understand but was struggling to process complex information. Each time he explained, Daniel became more condescending, his patience wearing thin as he was forced to repeat himself. "Maybe I should have Patricia look at these papers," I suggested at one point. "She's been handling our family's legal affairs for years, and I trust her judgment." Daniel's reaction was swift and telling. "Mom, I don't think that's necessary. Patricia charges a lot of money for consultations, and this is really pretty straightforward. Besides, she might try to overcomplicate things or suggest additional documents you don't really need." The irony was remarkable. Daniel was actively discouraging me from consulting with my own attorney because he knew Patricia would immediately recognize his scheme for what it was. But he presented his objection as concern for my finances and desire to keep things simple. "I suppose you're right," I said after a moment of apparent consideration. "You've always been so good with complicated things. I'm sure I can trust you to handle this properly." The satisfaction on Daniel's face was nauseating, but I maintained my grateful, slightly befuddled expression as I signed the power of attorney documents. In Daniel's mind, he had just achieved complete control over my assets and property. In reality, he had just provided me with documented evidence of his intent to defraud me. The conversation that followed was even more damning. Daniel pulled out a folder containing information about assisted living facilities, all carefully selected for their affordability rather than their quality. He had printed out brochures, pricing information, and availability details for places that looked more like warehouses than homes. "I've done a lot of research, Mom, and I think I've found some really good options for you." He spread the brochures across the coffee table like a real estate agent showing properties. "This place has a waiting list, but I think I can get you moved in within the next month or two." The facility he was promoting most heavily was called Sunset Manor, a grim-looking complex that advertised, quote, affordable care for seniors, and featured photographs of elderly residents sitting listlessly in institutional common areas. The monthly fees were less than half what the nicer places charged, which would leave Daniel with more of the proceeds from selling my property. "It looks very practical," I said, studying the brochure with the kind of resigned sadness an elderly person might feel when contemplating the end of their independence. "Practical is exactly right," Daniel agreed enthusiastically. "And they have medical staff on site, so you wouldn't need to worry about your health or safety anymore." He spent another hour going through the details of his plans for my future, each revelation more appalling than the last. He had calculated the exact timeline for selling the house, factored in the costs of moving me to assisted living, and even researched the legal requirements for disposing of my personal belongings. "Of course, we'll keep anything with sentimental value," he assured me when I asked about my furniture and photographs. "But a lot of this stuff would just be clutter in a smaller living space. It makes more sense to sell what we can and donate the rest." What he meant was that he intended to liquidate everything of value and pocket the proceeds, keeping only the items that were too worthless to bother selling. 47 years of accumulated memories and possessions would be reduced to whatever could fit in a single room at Sunset Manor. By the time Daniel left that afternoon, he was practically glowing with self-satisfaction. He had power of attorney, a cooperative mother who seemed grateful for his help, and a clear timeline for executing his plan. He probably went home and started calculating how he was going to spend his windfall. What he didn't know was that I had just spent 6 hours gathering enough evidence to destroy him completely. Every word of our conversation had been recorded in crystal clear audio and video. His attempts to manipulate me, his deliberate misrepresentation of my mental state, and his plans to defraud me of millions of dollars were all documented with courtroom-quality evidence. That evening, I called Sarah Chen to report on the day's progress. She listened to my account with professional satisfaction, making notes about the most damning moments from Daniel's visit. "The power of attorney is actually perfect," she said when I expressed concern about having signed the documents. "Since you signed under false pretenses after he deliberately misrepresented his intentions, the document is legally invalid. But it also proves his intent to commit fraud. The next phase of my plan would require even more careful orchestration." Daniel believed he now had control over my affairs, which meant he would start taking concrete steps towards selling the property and moving me to assisted living. I needed to let him dig himself in deeper while gathering additional evidence of his crimes. But I also needed to start building the foundation for my ultimate revenge. Daniel's betrayal had given me clarity about what I really wanted from the rest of my life, and it wasn't a modest existence in some corner of an institutional care facility. If Daniel thought I was too old and incompetent to manage my own affairs, I was going to show him exactly how capable a supposedly helpless elderly woman could be. By the time I was finished, he would understand that underestimating me had been the biggest mistake of his life. The game was in motion, and I was just getting started. The turning point came 3 weeks later, when Daniel arrived at my house with a real estate agent and a woman he introduced as a geriatric care specialist. I was expecting him, of course, having overheard his phone conversations through the surveillance equipment Tom Bradford had installed. What I hadn't expected was how brazenly confident he had become in his deception. "Mom, I brought some people I'd like you to meet," Daniel announced as he led them into my living room. "This is Janet Morrison from Prestige Properties, and Dr. Linda Walsh, who specializes in helping families transition elderly relatives to appropriate care facilities." Janet Morrison was a polished woman in her 40s, with the kind of aggressive friendliness that real estate agents cultivated like a second skin. Dr. Walsh appeared more serious, carrying herself with the professional authority of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions about other people's lives. I shuffled slowly to my favorite armchair, making sure to appear slightly confused by the unexpected visitors. "Oh my, I wasn't expecting company. Daniel, did you tell me these ladies were coming?" "I'm afraid I don't remember." The look of satisfaction that passed between Daniel and Dr. Walsh was so brief I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching for exactly that reaction. They were already building their case for my incompetence, and my apparent memory lapse was exactly the kind of evidence they needed. "That's all right, Mrs. Holloway," Dr. Walsh said in the patronizing tone medical professionals sometimes used with elderly patients. "Your son thought it would be helpful for me to meet you and assess your current living situation." "Assess my situation?" I repeated, allowing a note of anxiety to creep into my voice. "Is something wrong? Am I sick?" No, nothing like that," Daniel said quickly, though his eagerness to reassure me sounded more like impatience. "Dr. Walsh just wants to make sure you're getting the support you need. And Janet is here to look at the house, to give us an idea of what might need to be done before you move to your new place." While Dr. Walsh engaged me in what she probably thought was a subtle cognitive assessment, asking me about the date, my address, and recent activities, Janet Morrison was walking through my house with Daniel, taking notes and photographs. I could hear them discussing square footage, renovation needs, and market positioning as if I weren't sitting 20 feet away. "The property has incredible potential," Janet was saying as they returned to the living room. "With the right staging and some minor updates, we could easily get top dollar. The land alone is worth a fortune to developers. What developers? I asked, playing up the confusion angle. Are they going to build houses next to mine? Daniel and Janet exchanged a look before he knelt beside my chair with exaggerated patience. Mom, remember? We talked about this. You're going to be moving to a nice facility where people can take better care of you. That means we need to sell the house. Sell the house? I let my voice rise slightly, as if the reality was just sinking in. But this is my home. Your father and I built our life here. All my memories are here. Dr. Walsh leaned forward with practiced sympathy. Mrs. Holloway, I understand this feels overwhelming. Change is always difficult, especially as we get older. But sometimes the most loving thing we can do for ourselves is to accept help when we need it. The place Daniel has chosen for you is really lovely, Janet added, though I noticed she didn't specify which facility she was referring to. You'll have so much less to worry about, and your family will have peace of mind knowing you're being properly cared for. The entire conversation was being recorded, of course, but I needed more than just documentation of their manipulation. I needed them to reveal the full scope of their conspiracy, and that meant pushing them to be more specific about their plans. I suppose I should understand the financial aspects, I said hesitantly. How much will it cost to live in this new place? And what will we do with the money from selling the house? Daniel's eyes lit up at what he interpreted as my growing acceptance of his scheme. Don't worry about any of that, Mom. I'll handle all the money matters. The important thing is making sure you're safe and comfortable. But I'd like to understand, I insisted, with the kind of stubborn confusion elderly people sometimes displayed when they sensed they were being patronized. This house must be worth quite a lot of money. Where will it all go? Janet Morrison cleared her throat diplomatically. Well, there will be some costs associated with the sale, of course. Real estate commissions, legal fees, staging costs. And then the assisted living facility will require an entrance fee and monthly payments. How much of an entrance fee? I asked. Dr. Walsh consulted a folder she'd brought with her. Sunset Manor requires a $25,000 entrance fee, plus monthly payments of $3,800. It's quite reasonable for the level of care they provide. I did some quick mental arithmetic, making sure to look confused and overwhelmed by the numbers. At those rates, the proceeds from selling my house would last maybe 15 years if nothing went wrong and costs didn't increase. After that, I would presumably become a ward of the state or a burden on my children. It was a financial plan designed to benefit everyone except me. That seems like a lot of money, I said slowly. Are you sure we'll have enough? Absolutely, Daniel assured me with false confidence. The house will sell for more than enough to cover all your care costs. You won't need to worry about money ever again. What he didn't mention was that the house would sell for enough to cover my care costs and leave him with over $2 million in profit, assuming he went through with his plan to sell to Summit Ridge Holdings at below market rates. It was a masterpiece of manipulation, designed to make me feel grateful for being financially ruined. After the visitors left, I sat in my living room reviewing everything that had been recorded. Daniel, Janet Morrison, and Dr. Walsh had provided me with a wealth of incriminating evidence, from their coordinated deception about my mental state to their plans for liquidating my assets. But I still needed the smoking gun that would tie Daniel directly to Summit Ridge Holdings. That opportunity came sooner than I expected. 2 days later, Daniel called to tell me he had exciting news about the house sale. Mom, you're not going to believe this, but Janet found a buyer already. Someone who's willing to pay cash and close quickly, which means you could be moved into Sunset Manor within the month. That seems very fast, I said, injecting just enough anxiety into my voice to sound like someone who was being rushed into a life-changing decision. Are you sure we shouldn't take more time to think about this? Sometimes when the right opportunity comes along, you have to move quickly, Daniel explained with the patient tone of someone educating a child. This buyer is offering a very fair price, and they're willing to handle all the paperwork and closing costs. It's really the perfect solution. How much are they offering? I asked. Daniel paused just long enough for me to know he was about to lie. $1.4 million. It's a very generous offer, especially considering they're willing to buy the property as is without requiring any repairs or improvements. $1.4 million. for property worth nearly 3 times that amount. And Daniel was presenting it as generous. "That does sound like a lot of money," I said, playing the part of someone who had no idea what real estate was actually worth. "I suppose I should trust your judgment about these things." "Absolutely, Mom. I've done all the research, and this is definitely the best option for everyone involved." The next morning, I called an emergency meeting with Patricia Wells, my attorney. In her downtown office, surrounded by law books and legal documents, I laid out everything I had discovered about Daniel's scheme. Patricia listened with increasing outrage as I played selected recordings from the surveillance equipment. "Margaret, this is one of the most comprehensive cases of elder fraud I've ever seen," she said when I finished my presentation. "Your son isn't just trying to steal your property. He's attempting to have you declared incompetent, strip you of your legal rights, and confine you to substandard care while he profits from your assets." "What are my options?" I asked. Patricia was already making notes on a legal pad. "We have several avenues available. We can file criminal charges for fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. We can seek a restraining order to prevent him from making any decisions on your behalf. And we can pursue civil remedies to recover any damages and ensure this never happens again." "I want to do more than just stop him," I said. "I want him to understand the consequences of treating his mother like a mark to be conned." Patricia looked up from her notes with a slight smile. "What did you have in mind?" Over the next hour, we developed a strategy that would turn Daniel's own tactics against him. If he wanted to play games with legal documents and property transactions, we would give him a master class in how those games were supposed to be played. The first step was to secretly revoke the power of attorney Daniel thought gave him control over my affairs. Patricia drew up new documents that transferred my legal authority to her office, ensuring that any contracts or agreements Daniel tried to execute would be legally invalid. The second step was more creative. Patricia had connections throughout the legal and real estate communities, and she knew exactly how to make Daniel's life extremely complicated. "What if," she suggested, "we let Daniel proceed with his sale to Summit Ridge Holdings, but we make sure the transaction gets the attention it deserves from the appropriate authorities?" Within 24 hours, Patricia had contacted the State Attorney General's office, the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division, and several consumer protection agencies. She provided them with copies of all my evidence, along with a detailed explanation of the fraud Daniel was attempting to commit. But we didn't stop there. Patricia also reached out to investigative journalists who specialized in elder abuse cases, giving them exclusive access to my story in exchange for their commitment to expose Summit Ridge Holdings and their tactics for targeting elderly property owners. The third step was the most satisfying. We arranged for me to purchase a property that would serve as both my new home and the perfect symbol of everything Daniel had underestimated about me. The Whitmore estate had been on the market for almost 2 years, a stunning Gilded Age mansion on 50 acres overlooking the valley. The property included a main house with 12 bedrooms, a guest cottage, stables, formal gardens, and a private lake. It was exactly the kind of ostentatious display of wealth that would make Daniel's head explode when he realized what he had lost. More importantly, the estate was available for immediate purchase by someone with liquid assets and good credit. My investments and savings, carefully managed over decades, were more than sufficient to buy the property outright. "Are you sure about this, Margaret?" Patricia asked as we reviewed the purchase documents. "It's a significant commitment, and the maintenance costs will be substantial." "I've spent 72 years living modestly and saving for the future," I replied. "I think it's time I started enjoying the present." The purchase went through in record time. With closing scheduled for the same week, Daniel planned to finalize his fraudulent sale of my original property. The timing was crucial to the impact I wanted to achieve. While Patricia handled the legal arrangements, I began planning the practical aspects of my move. Rosa Martinez, my housekeeper, was delighted to accept a full-time position managing the household staff at the Whitmore estate. Eleanor Prescott agreed to serve as my social secretary, helping me navigate the complexities of hosting events and managing a property of that scale. I also hired a private security firm to provide discreet protection and surveillance. After Daniel's betrayal, I wanted to ensure that my new life would be protected from any future attempts at manipulation or fraud. The final preparations required the most careful timing. I needed Daniel to believe his plan was proceeding smoothly right up until the moment it collapsed around him. That meant continuing to play the role of confused, compliant elderly mother, while secretly dismantling every aspect of his scheme. Sarah Chen, my private investigator, provided regular updates on Daniel's activities. He was indeed working closely with Summit Ridge Holdings, having promised them a closing date within 2 weeks. He had also been in contact with Sunset Manor, arranging for my admission and paying the deposit from what he assumed would soon be his control over my assets. The beautiful irony was that Daniel was spending his own money to implement a plan that would never succeed. Every dollar he invested in his scheme was another dollar he would lose when the truth came to light. 1 week before Daniel's planned closing date, I made my move. It began with a phone call to Daniel, though this time my voice carried none of the confusion and uncertainty he had grown accustomed to. Daniel, I need you to come to the house tomorrow morning. There are some things we need to discuss. Of course, Mom. Is everything all right? You sound different. Everything is fine. I just have some news I think you'll find interesting. The next morning, Daniel arrived expecting another opportunity to manipulate his increasingly compliant mother. Instead, he found me sitting in the living room with Patricia Wells, Sarah Chen, and 2 detectives from the State Attorney General's office. Hello, Daniel, I said calmly as he stood frozen in the doorway. Please, have a seat. We have quite a lot to talk about. The color drained from Daniel's face as he took in the scene. His eyes darted from person to person, clearly trying to understand what was happening and how much trouble he was in. Mom, what's going on? Who are these people? This is Detective Martinez and Detective Thompson from the State Attorney General's office, I said, introducing the law enforcement officers with perfect composure. They're here to discuss your business relationship with Summit Ridge Holdings and your plans for my property. Daniel's mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to speak. I don't know what you're talking about. I've been trying to help you, Mom. Everything I've done has been for your own good. Detective Martinez consulted her notes. Mr. Holloway, we have recordings of conversations in which you discuss selling your mother's property to Summit Ridge Holdings for approximately half its market value, while representing to them that she suffers from dementia and is incompetent to manage her own affairs. Would you like to explain those conversations? Those recordings are illegal, Daniel said desperately. You can't use them. Actually, Patricia interjected, the recordings were made by your mother, in her own home, of conversations she was a party to. They're completely admissible evidence of your attempts to defraud her. Sarah Chen opened a folder and began laying out documents on the coffee table. We also have copies of emails between you and Summit Ridge Holdings dating back 6 months, detailing your negotiations to sell property that doesn't belong to you, plus forged documents, fabricated medical claims, and financial records showing the payments you expected to receive. Daniel looked at me with an expression of betrayal that would have been amusing if it weren't so pathetic. Mom, how could you do this to me? I'm your son. I was trying to take care of you. You were trying to steal from me, I replied evenly. There's a difference. Detective Thompson leaned forward. Mr. Holloway, you're under arrest for attempted elder fraud, conspiracy to commit real estate fraud, and filing false documents. You have the right to remain silent. As the detectives placed Daniel in handcuffs, he continued to protest his innocence and claim that everything had been a misunderstanding. He looked at me with desperate eyes, still hoping that maternal instinct would override my rational decision to hold him accountable for his actions. Mom, please. You don't understand what you're doing. Those people are just trying to turn you against your own family. Daniel, I said as the officers prepared to escort him from the house, I understand exactly what I'm doing. For the first time in months, I'm making decisions based on what's actually best for me, rather than what's convenient for people who want to exploit me. After they left, I sat in my living room for a long time, processing the emotional complexity of having my own son arrested. There was sadness, certainly, but also a profound sense of relief. The threat was over, and I was free to move forward with my life on my own terms. The media coverage began that afternoon. The story of an elderly woman who had orchestrated an elaborate sting operation to expose her son's attempt to defraud her captured public attention in a way that surprised everyone involved. News outlets across the country picked up the story, turning me into an unlikely symbol of elderly empowerment and resistance to elder abuse. The coverage also exposed Summit Ridge Holdings and their systematic targeting of elderly property owners. The company found itself under investigation by multiple agencies, and several other victims came forward with similar stories of family members who had been pressured into selling valuable properties for below-market prices. Daniel's legal troubles were just beginning. In addition to the criminal charges, he faced civil lawsuits from multiple parties, including me, Summit Ridge Holdings, who claimed he had misrepresented his authority to negotiate on my behalf, and several assisted living facilities that had been scammed by his promises of wealthy clients who would never materialize. But the most satisfying consequence was yet to come. 1 month after Daniel's arrest, I hosted a housewarming party at the Whitmore estate. The guest list included Patricia Wells, Sarah Chen, Eleanor Prescott, Rosa Martinez, and dozens of other people who had supported me through the ordeal. The party was held in the mansion's grand ballroom, with catering by the city's most exclusive restaurant and entertainment by a string quartet. As guests toured the property, marveling at the formal gardens and the view of the private lake, I couldn't help but think about Daniel sitting in his jail cell, contemplating the consequences of underestimating his mother. The final twist came during the party, when Patricia Wells stood up to make an announcement that surprised even me. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have some wonderful news to share. Margaret has decided to establish the Whitmore Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to protecting elderly people from financial fraud and family exploitation. The foundation would be funded by my estate and managed by a board of directors that included Patricia, Sarah, and several other experts in elder law and financial crimes. It would provide legal assistance to elderly victims of fraud, conduct research into prevention strategies, and advocate for stronger laws protecting senior citizens from exploitation. The Foundation's first initiative," Patricia continued, "will be to fund a scholarship program for law students who specialize in elder law, ensuring that future generations of attorneys are prepared to protect vulnerable older adults from the kind of scheme Daniel attempted to perpetrate against his mother." As guests applauded the announcement, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced since my husband's death. Daniel's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also revealed strengths and capabilities I hadn't known I possessed. At 72, I was embarking on the most meaningful chapter of my life. The estate became my headquarters for a new kind of existence, one focused on using my resources and experience to help other people avoid the fate Daniel had planned for me. I hosted fundraising events, spoke at conferences about elder abuse prevention, and worked with legislators to strengthen laws protecting elderly property owners. Rosa Martinez proved to be an exceptional estate manager, overseeing a staff that kept the property running smoothly while I focused on foundation work. Eleanor Prescott organized my social calendar and managed correspondence from the dozens of elderly people who wrote to thank me for standing up to family members who had tried to exploit them. 6 months after my housewarming party, I received a letter from Daniel. He had been sentenced to 5 years in prison and was required to pay full restitution for the financial losses his scheme had caused. The letter was full of self-pity and requests for forgiveness, but it also contained something I hadn't expected: a grudging acknowledgement of what he had underestimated about me. "I never realized how strong you were," he wrote. "I thought Dad had always been the one who made all the important decisions, and that you would be lost without someone to take care of you. I was wrong about a lot of things." I read the letter once and then filed it away without responding. Daniel would have plenty of time to think about his mistakes, and perhaps someday he would develop genuine remorse for what he had tried to do. But my focus was on the future, not on reliabilitying past betrayals. The Whitmore estate became known throughout the region as a center for social justice and elder advocacy. The foundation sponsored research, funded legal clinics, and provided a platform for elderly people to share their stories and support each other. It was exactly the kind of meaningful legacy I wanted to create with the resources Daniel had tried to steal from me. On quiet evenings, I would sit on the terrace overlooking the lake, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The peace I felt in those moments was profound, the satisfaction of a life well lived and a future full of purpose. Daniel had told me I was too old to live alone, that I needed someone else to make decisions for me and manage my affairs. Instead, I had proven that age was no barrier to intelligence, strength, or the ability to fight back against those who would exploit vulnerability. My name is Margaret Holloway, and at 72 years old, I learned that it's never too late to become exactly who you were meant to be. Some people see elderly women as easy targets, but they fail to understand that we've spent decades accumulating wisdom, resources, and the kind of quiet determination that comes from surviving everything life can throw at us. Daniel thought he was taking advantage of a helpless old woman. Instead, he discovered that underestimating someone who has lived through 7 decades of challenges, raised children, buried a spouse, and managed to accumulate significant wealth and property is perhaps the most dangerous mistake a person can make. The mansion stands as a testament to the fact that our later years can be our most powerful ones if we have the courage to claim them. The weeks following Daniel's arrest brought a parade of unexpected visitors to my door, each carrying their own story of family betrayal and elder exploitation. Word had spread through the community about what had happened, and suddenly I found myself serving as an unofficial counselor and advocate for other elderly people who had faced similar situations. The first was Helen Cartwright, an 80-year-old widow whose daughter had been systematically draining her bank accounts for months under the guise of helping with finances. Helen sat in my living room, clutching a tissue and recounting how she had discovered thousands of dollars missing from her savings account, all withdrawn by a daughter who claimed the money was being used for Helen's own care. "I trusted her completely," Helen said, her voice shaking with emotion. "When she said I was getting confused about money and that she needed to help me manage my accounts, I believed her. I thought I was losing my mind." I listened to Helen's story with a mixture of anger and recognition. The tactics her daughter had used were remarkably similar to Daniel's approach: the gradual undermining of confidence, the false claims about cognitive decline, the positioning of theft as care. It was clearly a playbook that predatory adult children used against their aging parents. "Have you contacted the police?" I asked. Helen shook her head. "She's my daughter. I can't send my own child to jail." "Helen," I said gently, "what your daughter did to you is a crime. The fact that she's family doesn't make it less serious. If anything, it makes it worse because she violated the trust that should exist between parent and child." Over the next hour, I helped Helen understand her options and connected her with Patricia Wells, who agreed to take her case. It was the beginning of what would become a regular pattern over the following months. Mrs. Chen from 3 blocks over had a son who was pressuring her to sign over her house so he could quote 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 quote. Rodriguez discovered that his nephew had been forging his signature on checks and using his credit cards for personal expenses. Mrs. Thompson's granddaughter had convinced her to invest her life savings in a fraudulent business scheme. Each story was different in its details, but they all shared the same fundamental elements: trusted family members exploiting the vulnerability of aging relatives, using manipulation and emotional pressure to gain access to assets, and presenting theft as care or family assistance. I began hosting weekly meetings in my living room, bringing together elderly people who had experienced financial exploitation by family members. We called ourselves the Silver Shield Network, and our mission was simple: to support each other, share information about legal resources, and prevent other seniors from falling victim to similar schemes. The meetings grew larger each week as word spread throughout the community. Eleanor Prescott helped me organize the logistics, while Rosa Martinez ensured we had refreshments and comfortable seating for everyone who attended. Patricia Wells became a regular speaker, explaining legal remedies and helping attendees understand their rights. But the most powerful aspect of the meetings was simply giving people a place to tell their stories without judgment. Many of the attendees had been made to feel ashamed of being victimized by their own families, as if they had somehow failed as parents or grandparents. The Silver Shield Network provided a space where they could process their experiences and realize that they were not alone. During one particularly memorable meeting, a woman named Dorothy Fisher shared her story about discovering that her son had been stealing from her for over 2 years. He had convinced her that she was becoming forgetful and needed his help managing her bills, then systematically transferred money from her accounts to his own. "The worst part wasn't losing the money," Dorothy said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "It was losing trust in my own judgment. He made me believe I was incompetent, that I couldn't take care of myself anymore." "That's exactly what my son did," I replied. "They don't just steal our money. They steal our confidence and our sense of independence." The conversation that followed was one of the most therapeutic experiences I'd had since my own ordeal began. We talked about the warning signs we had missed, the ways our children had manipulated our love for them, and the process of rebuilding trust in ourselves after such profound betrayal. It was during that meeting that I realized the Silver Shield Network needed to become something more formal and far-reaching than a weekly gathering in my living room. With Patricia's help, I began the process of incorporating it as a nonprofit organization, with the goal of providing resources and support to elderly victims of financial abuse throughout the state. The incorporation process gave me my first taste of the bureaucratic challenges involved in running a charitable organization. There were forms to file, regulations to understand, and complex requirements for maintaining nonprofit status. But I found the work invigorating, rather than overwhelming. After decades of managing household budgets and family logistics, the skills required for nonprofit administration felt familiar and manageable. Sarah Chen proved invaluable during this process, using her investigative skills to research best practices for elder advocacy organizations and identify potential funding sources. She also helped me understand the scope of the problem we were trying to address. Elder financial abuse is one of the fastest-growing crimes in the country, she explained during one of our planning meetings. It's estimated that seniors lose over $36 billion annually to financial exploitation, and most of it comes from family members. The statistics were staggering, but they also confirmed what I had suspected from the stories shared during our weekly meetings. Daniel's scheme wasn't an isolated incident or a unique betrayal. It was part of a widespread pattern of adult children exploiting their aging parents' trust and vulnerability. As the Silver Shield Network grew, I began receiving invitations to speak at conferences and community events about elder financial abuse prevention. My first speaking engagement was at the Regional Library's Senior Center, where I addressed an audience of about 50 people on the topic of protecting yourself from family financial exploitation. I was nervous before that first speech, uncertain whether my personal experience qualified me to offer advice to others. But as I looked out at the audience, I saw faces that reflected my own journey: confusion, anger, determination, and hope. These were people who understood that age didn't automatically make someone vulnerable, but that predators often targeted seniors specifically because they assumed elderly people would be easier to manipulate. "The most important thing to remember," I told the audience, "is that you have the right to maintain control over your own life and assets, regardless of what your family members might say about your capabilities." The response was overwhelmingly positive. People approached me after the speech to share their own stories, ask for advice, and thank me for speaking openly about such a difficult topic. Several mentioned that they had been experiencing pressure from family members but hadn't known how to respond or where to turn for help. That first speaking engagement led to others, and soon I was traveling throughout the state, addressing audiences at senior centers, legal aid clinics, and professional conferences. Each speech reinforced my understanding of how widespread the problem was and how desperately people needed resources and support. The most challenging speaking engagement came 6 months after Daniel's arrest, when I was invited to address a conference of family law attorneys about the legal aspects of elder financial abuse. The audience was composed of legal professionals who dealt with these cases regularly, and I was concerned about whether my perspective as a victim rather than an expert would be valuable to them. But as I prepared for that speech, I realized that my experience offered something that legal training couldn't provide: insight into the emotional and psychological dynamics that made elder financial abuse possible. Attorneys could understand the legal remedies available to victims, but they might not fully appreciate the complex family relationships that prevented victims from seeking help. When your own child betrays your trust, I told the attorneys, it's not just a financial crime. It's an attack on your identity as a parent and your sense of your place in the family structure. Victims often blame themselves, wondering what they did wrong or how they failed as parents. I explained how Daniel had used my love for him as a weapon against me, manipulating my desire to trust and support my children into acceptance of his control over my life. I described the gradual erosion of confidence that his scheme had produced, and the way he had isolated me from other sources of support and advice. Legal remedies are essential, I concluded, but they're not sufficient. Victims need emotional support, validation of their experiences, and help rebuilding their sense of agency and independence. The response from the attorneys was thoughtful and engaged. Several approached me afterward to discuss ways they could better support their elderly clients beyond just addressing the legal aspects of their cases. One attorney mentioned that she had been struggling with how to help a client who was reluctant to pursue charges against her grandson for stealing her retirement savings. I think I understand now that it's not just about the money, the attorney said. It's about helping her reclaim her sense of herself as a competent adult who deserves to be treated with respect. These speaking engagements also led to media attention that I hadn't anticipated. A local television station did a feature story about the Silver Shield Network, which was picked up by regional news outlets and eventually attracted national attention. I found myself being interviewed by journalists who were interested in the broader issue of elder financial abuse and the ways communities could address it. The media attention brought both opportunities and challenges. On the positive side, it helped raise awareness about elder financial abuse and brought more victims forward to seek help. The Silver Shield Network's membership grew dramatically, and we began receiving calls from people in other states who wanted to start similar organizations in their communities. But the attention also brought unwanted scrutiny of my personal life and family situation. Reporters wanted to know details about Daniel's scheme, my relationship with my other children, and my life before the betrayal occurred. Some of the coverage focused more on the sensational aspects of family betrayal than on the serious policy issues surrounding elder abuse prevention. The most difficult interview came when a national news magazine wanted to do a feature story about my case. The reporter was persistent in asking about my relationship with Daniel, whether I felt responsible for his behavior, and whether I regretted having him arrested. "Do you think there's anything you could have done differently as a parent to prevent this situation?" the reporter asked. The question stung because it reflected the kind of victim blaming that was common in elder abuse cases. The implication was that Daniel's criminal behavior was somehow my fault, that I had failed as a mother and was therefore partially responsible for being victimized. "Daniel made his own choices," I replied firmly. "I raised him with the same values and expectations as his siblings, both of whom grew up to be honest, caring adults. Daniel chose to prioritize his own financial gain over his mother's well-being, and that choice reflects his character, not my parenting." The interview was published with a headline that emphasized the family drama rather than the policy implications, but it did help bring attention to the Silver Shield Network and the resources we were providing to other victims. As the organization grew, I realized that I needed to hire professional staff to handle the increasing workload. Rosa Martinez had been helping with administrative tasks, but we needed people with specialized expertise in social work, legal advocacy, and nonprofit management. The first hire was Linda Morrison, a licensed clinical social worker who had experience working with elderly clients in healthcare settings. Linda brought crucial skills in counseling and case management that allowed us to provide more comprehensive support to people who contacted the Silver Shield Network for help. Linda's arrival marked a significant evolution in the organization's capabilities. While the weekly support meetings remained important, we were now able to offer individual counseling, help people navigate the legal system, and connect them with other resources in the community. The second hire was Marcus Thompson, a recent law school graduate who specialized in elder law and was passionate about advocacy work. Marcus handled the legal research and education components of our mission, developing materials to help seniors understand their rights and recognize the warning signs of financial exploitation. With professional staff in place, the Silver Shield Network began operating more like a traditional nonprofit organization. We developed formal intake procedures for new clients, created educational materials for distribution throughout the community, and established partnerships with other organizations that served elderly populations. One of our most successful initiatives was a partnership with the local police department to provide training for officers who responded to elder abuse reports. Many law enforcement personnel had limited experience with financial crimes against seniors and weren't always equipped to recognize the signs of family exploitation. Marcus developed a training curriculum that covered the legal aspects of elder financial abuse, the psychological tactics used by perpetrators, and the resources available to help victims. The training sessions were well received by officers, who appreciated having concrete tools and strategies for handling these complex cases. The partnership with law enforcement also led to better outcomes for victims who did decide to pursue criminal charges against family members. Officers who had received our training were more likely to take reports seriously, conduct thorough investigations, and connect victims with support services. As the Silver Shield Network's reputation grew, we began receiving funding from foundations and government agencies that supported elder advocacy work. The financial support allowed us to expand our services and reach more people throughout the region. But the most meaningful measure of our success was the individual stories of people we had helped. Dorothy Fisher, the woman who had shared her story during one of our early meetings, successfully recovered most of the money her son had stolen and was living independently in her own home. Helen Cartwright had pressed charges against her daughter and was working with a financial advisor to rebuild her savings. Each success story reinforced my belief that elderly people didn't need to accept being victimized by family members who saw them as easy targets. With the right support and resources, seniors could protect themselves, hold perpetrators accountable, and reclaim control over their lives. The Silver Shield Network's work also attracted attention from researchers who were studying elder financial abuse. Dr. Amanda Chen, a gerontologist at the State University, approached us about collaborating on a research project that would document the long-term impacts of family financial exploitation on elderly victims. There's a lot of research on the financial aspects of elder abuse, Dr. Chen explained, but much less attention has been paid to the psychological and social consequences. Your organization has unique access to victims who are willing to share their experiences. The research partnership proved valuable for both the Silver Shield Network and the academic community. Dr. Chen's study provided rigorous documentation of the ways family financial exploitation affected victims' mental health, social relationships, and overall quality of life. The findings supported our advocacy efforts and helped make the case for increased funding for elder abuse prevention programs. The research also revealed something I had suspected from our work with victims. Family financial exploitation was often part of a broader pattern of emotional abuse and control. Perpetrators didn't just steal money, they systematically undermined their victims' confidence, isolated them from other sources of support, and convinced them that they were incapable of managing their own affairs. The financial abuse is just the visible symptom, Dr. Chen observed during one of our research meetings. The underlying dynamic is about power and control, using the victim's age and family relationship to justify increasingly intrusive management of their life. This insight shaped the Silver Shield Network's approach to supporting victims. We began focusing more on helping people rebuild their sense of agency and independence, not just recovering stolen assets or pursuing legal remedies. Linda Morrison developed support groups specifically for people who were struggling with the emotional aftermath of family betrayal. These groups provided a space for processing complex feelings about trust, family relationships, and aging that weren't addressed by traditional counseling approaches. Many of our clients feel like they've lost not just money but their place in the family, Linda explained. They're grieving the relationship they thought they had with their children or grandchildren, while also trying to rebuild their confidence in their own judgment. The support groups became one of our most popular services, with waiting lists for membership and requests to start additional groups in other parts of the region. The demand reinforced our understanding that elder financial abuse created needs that went far beyond financial recovery. As the second anniversary of Daniel's arrest approached, I found myself reflecting on how much my life had changed since that terrible day when I discovered his betrayal. The Silver Shield Network had grown into a respected organization that served hundreds of people annually. I had become a recognized advocate for elder rights and a sought-after speaker on financial abuse prevention. But perhaps more importantly, I had discovered capabilities and strengths I hadn't known I possessed. At 74 years old, I was running a nonprofit organization, managing a staff of dedicated professionals, and making a meaningful contribution to my community's well-being. The irony wasn't lost on me that Daniel's attempt to portray me as incompetent and incapable had ultimately led to me demonstrating just how much I could accomplish when given the opportunity. His betrayal had been devastating, but it had also freed me from the constraints of others' expectations about what elderly people could or should do. During a quiet moment in my office at the Whitmore estate, I wrote a letter to Daniel. It wasn't the first time I had tried to articulate my thoughts about what had happened between us, but this letter felt different. It wasn't motivated by anger or a desire for reconciliation, but by a need to put our relationship into perspective and perhaps offer him a different way of understanding what he had lost. I want you to know that I've forgiven you, I wrote. Not because what you did was acceptable, but because carrying anger toward you would prevent me from fully embracing the life I've built since your betrayal. I described the Silver Shield Network and the work we were doing to help other families avoid the kind of crisis his actions had created. I told him about the speaking engagements, the research partnerships, and the policy advocacy that had grown out of my experience with his scheme. You saw me as an aging woman who was becoming a burden and a liability, I continued. But that perception said more about your limitations than mine. You couldn't imagine that someone my age might have wisdom, resources, and capabilities that you hadn't recognized. I sealed the letter and mailed it to the federal prison where Daniel was serving his sentence. I didn't expect a response, and I didn't need one. The letter was less about communication with him than about acknowledging how far I had traveled from the person I had been when his scheme began. The Silver Shield Network continued to grow and evolve, adapting to meet the changing needs of elderly people in our community. We added services, expanded our geographic reach, and developed new partnerships with organizations that shared our mission of protecting vulnerable adults from exploitation. But the core of our work remained the same: believing that elderly people deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, supporting victims of family financial abuse, and working to prevent other families from experiencing the kind of betrayal that had initially brought us together. My name is Margaret Holloway, and at 74 years old I've learned that some of life's most meaningful chapters can begin when you least expect them. Daniel thought he was writing the ending to my story of independence and agency. Instead, he had simply provided the catalyst for its most important beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.